The lighthouse at Point Lookout stood like a solitary sentinel against the crashing waves of the Chesapeake Bay, its light flickering like a wavering heartbeat in the dark. At the very tip of Maryland, where the land dissolves into the murky waters, the Point Lookout Lighthouse had guided ships safely to shore for centuries. But those who lived near its weather-beaten walls knew a darker truth. The lighthouse was a place of shadows, where the living and the dead intertwined like tangled vines, and the air itself seemed thick with the weight of untold stories. Rachel Baker had always been fascinated by old, abandoned places. As an investigative journalist, she thrived on uncovering secrets buried beneath layers of time. The lighthouse had caught her attention when she stumbled upon an old newspaper article that spoke of strange occurrences there. A door that would open and close on its own, footsteps in the night, and voices carried on the wind. The place had a reputation. It was a well-known haunted spot, whispered about by locals but mostly forgotten by the outside world. But for Rachel, it was an opportunity she couldn't resist. She had heard of the place's infamous reputation, but she wanted more than the rumors. She wanted the truth. She drove down the narrow, winding roads to Point Lookout on a chilly autumn afternoon, the trees lining the path like skeletal hands reaching up to the overcast sky. By the time she arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out like fingers across the marshland. The lighthouse, once a beacon of hope, now looked like a fortress of despair. Its whitewashed walls were stained and weathered by salt and time, the red roof missing tiles here and there, and the once bright light was dim and distant, barely a spark against the encroaching night. She felt a shiver run down her spine, not just from the cold, but from the sense that something was watching, waiting. She met with the caretaker, a grizzled old man named Thomas who had lived by the lighthouse for nearly 3 decades. His eyes were clouded with age but sharp with something else. Fear, or perhaps knowledge. He eyed her warily, as if sizing her up. "You don't belong here," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "None of us do." Rachel smiled, attempting to dispel the tension. "I've come to learn about the stories, the hauntings," she explained, her voice bright with feigned confidence. Thomas shook his head. "Stories," he scoffed, though there was no humor in his voice. "They're not stories, miss. They're warnings." He reluctantly led her inside, the heavy door creaking like an old bone as it swung open. The interior was damp and musty, a mix of salt air and mildew. The walls were lined with faded photographs of the lighthouse keepers who had once lived here, their eyes seeming to follow her as she moved. "This place used to be a Civil War hospital," Thomas said, almost as if talking to himself. "Hundreds died here, and not all of them went peacefully. The land, it holds on to things like a wound that never heals. You can feel it, can't you?" Rachel nodded slowly, feeling an inexplicable chill seep into her bones. There was something off about the place, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of the sea outside. She noticed a door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. "What's in there?" she asked, pointing. Thomas's face turned pale. "That's the keeper's quarters. It's where most of the activity happens." Ignoring his warning, Rachel moved toward the door, her steps echoing against the stone floor. She pushed it open, revealing a small, sparsely furnished room with a narrow bed, a desk covered in dust, and an old lantern hanging from a hook. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as if she had walked into a different time, a different world. Then she heard it, a soft, raspy whisper, like the faintest breath against her ear. "Help me." She spun around, her heart racing, but there was no one there. "Thomas?" she called out, but the hallway was empty. She was alone. The whisper came again, louder this time, more desperate. "Help me." Rachel felt her hands tremble. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice wavering. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and she could see her breath misting in the cold air. The door behind her slammed shut with a force that shook the walls, and she stumbled back, her pulse hammering in her ears. And then she saw her, a woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, standing in the corner of the room. Her hair hung in damp, dark strands over her face, her skin pale and translucent. Her eyes were wide and hollow, like dark wells of infinite sorrow. She reached out a hand, trembling, pleading. "Help me," Rachel felt a scream rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind outside. The woman's face contorted with anguish. "I'm lost," she moaned, and then as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished into the shadows, leaving behind an icy chill and a suffocating silence. Rachel stood there, frozen, her mind reeling. The stories were true. Something haunted this place, something filled with pain and sorrow. She knew she should leave, that she should get out while she still could, but a part of her, some stubborn part, refused. She needed to understand, to find out why these spirits lingered. She spent the next few days delving deeper into the lighthouse's history, uncovering stories of tragedy and loss. There were accounts of shipwrecks, of men who had gone mad from isolation, and of a young woman who had been found dead on the rocks below, her body broken and battered by the sea. Some said she had been a nurse during the war. Others claimed she was the wife of a lighthouse keeper who had disappeared without a trace. Rachel discovered that the woman in white was believed to be Ann Davis, the wife of one of the last keepers. She had died in a terrible accident, falling from the cliffs during a stormy night. Her body had never been found, but many believed her spirit remained, bound to the lighthouse by a longing that death could not sever. That night, Rachel returned to the keeper's quarters, determined to make contact again. She sat in the dark, the old lantern flickering beside her, and waited. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and somewhere in the distance she heard the mournful cry of a seagull. And then she felt it, a presence, cold and heavy, settling in the room like a fog. She saw the figure again, emerging from the shadows, her eyes wide and desperate. "Help me," the woman whispered again, her voice a soft, mournful plea. Rachel took a deep breath, steadying herself. "How can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The woman's face seemed to soften, her eyes glistening with tears. "Find him," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Rachel frowned. "Oh, who do you want me to find?" But before the woman could answer, a sudden gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the lantern and plunging her into darkness. The woman's figure faded, and Rachel was left alone, her heart pounding, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The next morning, she left the lighthouse, her mind buzzing with questions. Who was the woman searching for? And why did her spirit remain trapped in this place, caught between worlds? Rachel knew she would have to return, to dig deeper, to uncover the secrets buried within the walls of Point Lookout. But as she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that something or someone was following her. The lighthouse loomed in her rearview mirror, its light flickering like a dying ember. And for the first time, she felt a deep, unsettling fear that she had awoken something that should have remained asleep. And as the mist rolled in from the bay, swallowing the lighthouse whole, she heard the whisper again, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. "Help me."